behind the appointment of a trio of MAGA personalities to three of the most critical cabinet posts in our country: the Director of National Intelligence, the Attorney General, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense. If you look behind the headlines that have ensued and the chaos that has been the quick reaction from Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill, and now all the swirling questions in newsrooms around ethics and the confirmation process, what that looks like, a pretty obvious and intentional theme emerges. As Tim Snyder, author of On Tyranny, puts it, quote, "Taken together, Trump's candidates constitute an attempt to wreck the American government." All three of Trump's most high-profile picks, Tulsi Gabbard, Pete Hegseth, and Matt Gaetz, are defined publicly both by the things they've said in the contempt they have for the role of the departments they're now going to lead, and the views that they have that are in stark contrast to many of the Republicans who have now been asked to vote to confirm them to lead those agencies. We'll start with Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, who has said repeatedly that the West is to blame for the war in Ukraine, an opinion far out of line with the views of America's bipartisan national security experts.
Kamala Harris was in Europe a few days before Putin invaded Ukraine, speaking very clearly and loudly about how Ukraine should become a member of NATO. This was one of the main instigators crossing this red line that Russia, during Putin's reign and before him, has been the red line. And for any objective-minded person, you can understand why they wouldn't want NATO missiles sitting in Ukraine.
So, again, whatever you think of that, you have to look at how it squares with the views of outgoing GOP Senate leader Mitch McConnell and a sizable chunk of his caucus.
By assisting Ukraine today, America is directly demonstrating our commitment to the basic principles of territorial integrity and national sovereignty, changing the calculus for others considering military aggression, and lowering the odds of a far costlier and far more deadly future conflicts in the process.
And then take Pete Hegseth. In his book, he makes it clear that he agrees with Donald Trump when Donald Trump says that our adversaries abroad are not as big of a threat to America as the, quote, enemies within. He writes this, quote, "While the post-9/11 generation of patriots spent 2 decades fighting enemies abroad, we allowed America's domestic enemies at home to gobble up cultural, political, and spiritual territory. Leftists stole a lot from us, but we won't let them take this. Time for round 2. We won't miss this war," end quote. So what does it mean for someone who sees Trump's political critics and is now going to be heading the Pentagon as the real threat for that person to now have command and control of the U.S. military? And then there's the curious case of Matt Gaetz, a one-man chaos agent who in the House of Representatives has earned himself near universal contempt and loathing from his own Republican colleagues. David French writes it this way in the New York Times, quote, "He was primarily responsible for deposing the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in a fit of pique, and he so alienated House colleagues that one had to be physically restrained from attacking him on the House floor. He has a reputation for showing colleagues explicit pictures of his sexual partners, and he is under a House ethics investigation into whether he had sex with an underage girl while he was a member of Congress," end quote. In the coming days and weeks, Republicans are going to be asked to confirm appointees who don't agree with their ideological views or priorities and who all the Republicans know are not up to any of the jobs they've been tapped to do. But none of that is the point, is it? Here's how Steve Bannon reacted to the choice of Matt Gaetz as AG.
Matt Gaetz is the fiercest of the fierce warriors. He is the firebrand of firebrands. He's going to hit the Department of Justice with a blowtorch. And that blowtorch is a guy named Matt Gaetz.
I could say a lot of things about Bannon, but at least he says it all out loud, right? And he's been saying it for years. Trump's picks are part of this project that Bannon has described for years now publicly as the destruction of the administrative state, the fulfillment of a vision Bannon has been fighting for years. Here he is making that point earlier today.
We're going to burn some of these institutions down to the ground because you know why? They need to be burned down to the ground.
So we start today. Where else? With some of our favorite reporters and friends. With me at the table, president of the National Action Network, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, the Reverend Al Sharpton's here. Also joining us, former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Heaphy's here. And joining us remotely, chief political columnist, host of the podcast Impolitic for Puck, MSNBC National Affairs analyst John Heilemann. Also joining us remotely, New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt is here. John Heilemann, I start with you and sort of your body of Bannon reporting. I think Bannon started with this effort, which again was always out in the open, of destroying the administrative state, if I remember the reporting correctly, with a whiteboard in his West Wing office during the short time that he was in the administration. And it may have taken longer to arrive at this, but it seems very intentional that the cabinet picks from Trump are meant to divide newsrooms and send them chasing their tails to see if the ethics investigation into Gates is going to break, or Tulsi Gabbard's comments that even Sean Hannity found offensive are going to get any reaction from the mighty Senate Republicans, or if Hegseth's myriad scandals are going to... I mean, it seems that the sum of the reaction to those is intended to advance the broader project of Bannon's.
I think that the first time that Steve Bannon ever said the phrase, and it actually is the deconstruction of the administrative state, which is the same thing as the destruction of it, but I think the first time he said it out loud to everybody in the world was in February of 2017 at CPAC, where the Trump forces were ascendant at that point. Steve was in the White House at that point, and he was, I think, interviewed on stage at CPAC by Reince Priebus, or at least was on stage with Reince Priebus. But I think it was Priebus talking to Bannon, and Bannon talked about the big priorities in the Trump term. He talked about nationalism in terms of foreign policy. He talked about nationalism in terms of economic policy. And then the third thing he talked about was this deconstruction of the administrative state. And you know, it's the one thing Steve is not only someone who's been saying this out loud forever, through that entire, from the moment they walked in the doors there in January of 2017 until now, when Trump was out of office. He's also someone who is unlike Donald Trump, an extraordinarily well-read and sophisticated thinker. And when I say sophisticated, I don't want anybody to think that means I think he's a good thing in terms of some of these thoughts. But I mean, he is someone who has thought a lot about this stuff. He's read his Lenin, and that's what this is really. It's a Leninist project. And I think to your point, Nicole, I think there's a lot of things going on with these. Some of it is directed at the media, and that's the frame that you were just putting on it, which is to create chaos in terms of how we cover it. But it's also, really importantly, these are tests of the Republicans in the Senate. It is not a coincidence that Trump dropped the Matt Gaetz announcement to basically break up John Thune's welcome party, his victory party, as having won as majority leader on the Senate side, on the Republican Senate side. It was like dropping a turd in his punch bowl at his party, basically, and sort of saying, okay, this is the most unacceptable, or among the most unacceptable people you could ever put in this job. Now, Mr. Thune, pass him, please. And unlike the leadership vote, which is a secret vote, Trump did not want John Thune to be leader. He would rather have had Rick Scott or John Cornyn. This is not a secret vote. This is a public vote. So now every Republican senator is facing the same dynamic that they faced every other time in Trump's political history, which is, do what I say, or I will bring the wrath of MAGA down on you. And I think even in this negotiation, we're seeing go back and forth on the question of recess appointments. He is testing the Senate, and he's trying to make it clear that either you will be my rubber stamp willingly, or you will be my rubber stamp because I force you to be my rubber stamp. He's trying to take away advice and consent from the Senate effectively. And you saw John Thune last night with Bret Baier on Fox News, and he said, well, I'd really rather do it the normal way. We hope we can do it the normal way. But the last words out of his mouth were, nothing's off the table, meaning doing these things by recess appointment is on the table. And you can already see a very familiar dynamic where Donald Trump may end up incredibly, just mind-bogglingly, he might not be getting his way on these nominees.
Let me read you a little bit more from Tim Snyder on the rule of law. A modern democratic state depends upon the rule of law. Before anything else is possible, we have to endorse the principle that we are all governed by law and that our institutions are grounded in law. This enables a functional government of a specific sort in which leaders can be regularly replaced by elections. It allows us to live as free individuals within a set of rules that we can alter together. The rule of law depends on people who believe in the spirit of law. Matt Gaetz, the proposed Attorney General, is the opposite of such a person. It is not just that he flouts the law himself spectacularly and disgustingly. It is that he embodies lawlessness and can be counted upon to abuse the law to pursue Trump's political opponents. The end of the rule of law is an essential component of a regime change. And then just to underscore Tim Snyder's point and John Heilman's, here's how a Republican, former House member, now senator, describes Matt Gaetz's conduct. And I play this because it's also been revealed today that Speaker Mike Johnson doesn't plan to release the ethics report into Matt Gaetz. But a lot of the conduct is known. This is a Republican senator.
There's a reason why no one in the conference came and defended him, because we had all seen the videos he was showing on the House floor that all of us had walked away of the girls that he had slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night.
So it's important because to John Heilman's point, this is about humiliating the Senate Republicans and either making them confirm that guy who, in the telling of another Republicans, would, quote, show videos on the House floor of all the girls he slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night, end quote. It's about either making them confirm him or taking away all their power and confirming him without them in a recess appointment. What is the impact of that on the rule of law?
Tremendous evisceration of the rule of law. And it shows, Nicole, that the paradigm in this country has shifted from a right versus left paradigm to an insider-outsider paradigm. The Republican voices have been very strongly critical of Matt Gaetz, his own caucus apparently. Glad to see him go. Nonetheless, he's nominated as Attorney General. It shows, again, that the goal is deconstruction, evisceration of the rule of law. This notion that there's some sort of institutional Washington that's beyond party but is sort of incumbency or those that are in charge versus everyone else, and the president-elect positioning himself on the side of everyone else, that's a new ball game. Again, not we don't agree on policy or the right versus the left. Insider-outsider has the potential as a conflict to really erode institutions like the rule of law.
And so what happens? I mean, are you afraid that they'll come looking for you because of your role in the January 6 hearings?
I think there's no question that asking questions or launching investigations, even meritless ones, has consequences. Absolutely. It could be expensive and time-consuming and difficult for people who have done absolutely nothing wrong but exercise the authority that has been given them through official channels. Would have to go through those investigations. I'm not worried ultimately on criminal or other exposure. I am worried about inconvenience and expense and intimidation by the launching of those kinds of investigations.
Mike Schmidt, you've done some incredible reporting on Trump's ambitions in his first term to use the Justice Department to retaliate against his political enemies, and you've chronicled the roadblocks that he encountered. How does Gaetz, and if we're to presume another ally at the FBI, how do they eradicate those hurdles?
Well, Trump basically ran into two problems with weaponizing the Justice Department. One was having an attorney general that would go along with what he wanted. As Bill Barr writes in his book, Trump is complaining to him in December of 2020 that he never prosecuted Jim Comey. That was something that Trump tried to do throughout his entire presidency. It was something that Trump tried to do himself in 2018. He wanted to go out and prosecute Comey himself, even though Trump's not a prosecutor. So that was the first roadblock. The second roadblock that they ran into was the courts. In that case, they ran into the courts in the case of Andy McCabe. Andy McCabe, the former deputy FBI director, was under investigation. They took his case to a grand jury, and the grand jury came back and said they weren't going to indict him. That was a roadblock there. They didn't. There were no charges to be brought against McCabe because of that. The first, with Gates at the top of the Justice Department, that roadblock that Barr had created on the issue of Comey would be gone. I don't think I'm taking too many leaps here to say that Matt Gaetz is someone who would go along with exactly what Donald Trump wanted. That is essentially what Matt Gaetz's brand is. I was reading back some of the stories that we had done about the investigations into Gaetz, and I saw that the way that Trump first talked to Gaetz was that he saw him on Fox News in late 2017 railing against the Mueller investigation, and he called him and said, that he needed warriors or something of that sort to help him in his efforts, and that's exactly what Gaetz did. So I think what you may see, which would be different, is more interaction between the Justice Department, the executive branch, and the judicial branch, where the Justice Department would try to do things and the courts would be forced to really weigh in and determine whether there is merit to what the department is doing. And we saw that in the Andy McCabe case, but in most cases, the investigations that Trump wanted were sort of never really got out the door at the Justice Department. They never really got to charges. There were just investigations. And to Tim's point, there is an enormous amount that can be done on the investigative front if the department wants to investigate something or someone. And there are not a lot of checks on that in many ways. They can interview people. They can send out subpoenas. If they want to get a search warrant, they have to go to the courts. But I think you would see here more as a clash of the branches. You would see the Justice Department trying to do things and the judicial branch being forced to come and weigh in and say whether they thought it was okay or not.
I think the John Durham investigation also may prove instructive, that he was sort of a U.S. Attorney's Office within the Justice Department, greenlit by Bill Barr, had free reign over all sorts of people Trump perceived as political enemies, actually brought 2 cases to trial and lost both of them. I want to pick up that thread. I have to sneak in a quick break first. Also ahead for us, as has been evident all week, Matt Gaetz is not the only cabinet pick that many worry will want to blow up the agency and the professionals who work in it once they lead it. Pentagon Chief Nominee Pete Hegseth's past. We'll be getting a closer look, including his thoughts on a diversified U.S. military. We'll tell you what the new reporting reveals. Matt Gaetz may be creating a swirl of chaos for the Trump transition team, but he's not alone. The dizzying shock of these selections means that in terms of vetting, if there is to be any, the general public is just now beginning to catch up on the reporting, what's available in the media about all these folks. The result, an increasingly clear picture of exactly who lawmakers are going to be asked to confirm for the most important positions in the U.S. government. Take Pete Hegseth, for instance, the Fox News host who might be our next Secretary of Defense. Early this morning, in response to a number of media inquiries, the city of Monterey, California, released some information from a 2017 police report confirming a sexual assault investigation into Hegseth and an incident that involved bruises to someone's right thigh. To be clear, no charges were filed. The Trump campaign statement on the matter reads in part, quote, Mr. Hegseth has vigorously denied any and all accusations and no charges were filed, end quote. In a phone interview with NBC News, Hegseth's attorney said this, quote, the police statement speaks for itself. He was cleared. There's not much more that I can say. It didn't happen, end quote. But all that aside, just take what Hegseth has said in public, because there's plenty. Following a review of what he's written, the Washington Post today published, it found Hegseth, quote, forcefully argued that steps to incorporate women and transgender personnel across the military are eroding U.S. security and that Islam is a violent force threatening to overtake America and should be countered by a new crusade. maybe shocking, but probably not surprising from a person who said similar things on national television.
The Pentagon likes to say, our diversity is our strength. What a bunch of garbage. I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated.
Resolve the idea that Democrats are not for voter ID. Did Donald Trump lose the election in 2020?
Real quick.
Can you answer the question? Did Donald Trump lose the election in 2020?
I'm answering questions. Don't really feel any obligation to answer anything of you. When you import the third world, you get third world hierarchy, values, and chaos. Vets groups mostly encourage vets to apply for every government benefit they can ever get. Right now, a lot of groups are convincing vets to give, get, take more from the system as opposed to just what you need for the service you gave. I don't think I've washed my hands for 10 years. Really, I don't really wash my hands ever.
Help me! Everyone's back. Rev?
If he hasn't washed his hands for 10 years, I don't know if I want to see him have lunch at the Pentagon with people. But I think that it is, again, very frightening to see that this kind of person with these kind of views, I mean, anti-women and proud of it, anti-Muslim and proud of it. And we're going to put him over the defense of all the countries. So women being in the military hasn't improved the military, but you trust us to defend all women and men. I mean, how outrageous is that? This is 2024, and rather than somebody like that being isolated as someone who did not come into the 21st century, we're going to make him the Secretary of Defense, and by the way, succeed the first and only black Secretary of Defense. That's the irony of this, but that is how Donald Trump thinks.
You know, I mean, John Heilemann, the Pentagon is the crown jewel, not just of the U.S. government. I'd say along with the rule of law and our role in gathering and sort of coordinating intelligence to protect national security, ours and that of our allies, right? Those are like the three jewels of the U.S. government. And Trump can pick whoever he wants, and it's like in some ways the most obvious choice of all, along with Gates. But he can't afford to have the military not like this pick. And there are a lot of women in the military. The military, I believe, I know it's the most diverse federal workforce. It might actually be the most diverse workforce in the country. And Trump can't have the military tear itself apart. Amy McGrath said that if Milley and McChrystal and Kelly are court-martialed, it would tear the Pentagon apart. It would tear the military apart. I mean, what is your sense of how much of Pete Hegseth will become the military and how much of this is a figurehead?
Boy, there's a lot to say there, Nicole. First of all, I had happened to look this up yesterday because I was curious. 2.8 million people work for the United States Department of Defense. 2.8 million people. The largest workforce in the United States and one of the largest in the world. I'm not sure what's bigger anywhere in the world, but I do know it's that number. It's an extraordinary thing. $864 billion a year budget. $864 billion a year. That's the stuff that we know about. That doesn't include any of the black budget stuff that basically makes the budget of the Pentagon essentially unlimited. You know, the managerial task here is enormous, right? So this goes back to one of the things we were talking about before. If you ask the question and you want to like kind of talk about Pete Hegseth in terms of is he qualified to run the Defense Department? Well, the answer is obviously no. I mean, it's one of the most, for generations, it has been seen as the hardest cabinet position. It is, you know, a monstrosity in some ways. It's so enormous and it kills people. It causes people to have nervous breakdowns when they're trying to run it. Historically, that has been true. Michael Beschloss was talking to me about that today. So he's obviously not qualified. He's not qualified to run it. He's qualified to ruin it.
New York Times bestselling author, my colleague and dear friend, Rachel Maddow here. Rachel, where to start? You go.
Well, I don't know. I don't know where to start. I mean, I do feel like, Nicole, that you maybe more than anyone, has been very clear-eyed about what was coming and about what was being promised here, and that there was no reason to expect this to be moderated or normal, or that this is going to tack back toward the center or towards anything that looked like traditional American politics. I mean, you did your Autocracy in America series, and listen, we saw what was going to happen, and now it is happening. And so I do feel like this is a moment for people to get real and for people to stop saying, like, oh, this is going to end up being much more moderate than anybody expected. When are you going to stop? So when are you going to start apologizing for saying that democracy was threatened? I mean, I think it's time to get real and realize that this is really what we're up against. But I also think the fact that we all feel a little bit, I don't know if flummoxed is the right word, sort of rocked by the increasing incredulity of these choices, is that it is meant to shock us. It's meant to adjust our sense of what is normal, what is possible, and to sort of so disorient us as to what it counts to propose governance in the United States that we're ready for the most radical pronouncements and actions. And I do think we're supposed to feel the way that we do right now. I think that's part of this. It's a shock and awe campaign against American traditions and mores. And that's, I think, how most of the country feels about it.
I mean, I think to sort of sustain the military analysis, the Iraq War starts with a shock and awe bombing campaign. The war is a catastrophe. I mean, it doesn't connote competence. It doesn't signal that he will succeed in successfully demolishing American democracy. It does mean that we as a press still, every single time, chase the shiny object. And this week, the shiny objects are named Matt Gaetz, Tulsi Gabbard, and RFK Jr. Next week, they'll be named, or maybe by 9 o'clock, they'll be named Steve Bannon and Kash Patel, and they may be running the FBI. Those are the shiny objects. But the movement is propelled by this hatred of the Democratic Party and the media elites, but also a promise to deliver on the economy, on immigration. And the people in charge of those two things, one of them is an alleged child sex trafficker, and the other is, by her own telling, a dog killer. I mean, the competence may be where he gets sort of bollocksed up.
I think that the idea of the authoritarian promise is that everything shrivels in government other than the will of the leader, right? So you don't necessarily put a Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of HHS because you're hoping for great things from HHS. I mean, Matt Gaetz, among all the other things we can say about Matt Gaetz, he has explicitly proposed abolishing the Justice Department, not specifically just abolishing the FBI and the ATF, but talking about abolishing the Justice Department. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, as the Director of National Intelligence, the idea that Tulsi Gabbard, in a normal circumstance, could get a security clearance to be like a Walmart-style greeter at any U.S. intelligence agency, let alone get past the security barriers, is insane. So you do that because you want the worst for these agencies, because you want the worst for the U.S. government, because you think that the U.S. government is worthless. That's part of consolidating power, to make the U.S. government nothing other than the leader and people who will do what he says. And there not being any repository of expertise, let alone, just general day-to-day know-how anywhere. So it's a sort of, I mean, as Steve Bannon used to say, it's a sort of Leninist project, right? Destroy the state. This is the cabinet that you nominate to not to run the U.S. government to do anything, but to destroy the U.S. government, so that the U.S. government can be fundamentally reimagined as something much more like a unitary, authoritarian, or autocratic, for lack of a better term, system.
What are you looking at as the friction points? I mean, in the first Trump presidency, it was the firing of Jim Comey after he refused to, quote, see to it to let Mike Flynn go. Let Mike Flynn go. Comey says no. Trump embarks on a 4-year-long crusade against the FBI and the Department of Justice. To your point, Matt Gaetz is going to be in charge of the department, and an as yet named person expected to replace his last handpicked head of the FBI, Christopher Wray. He's sort of threatened Jerome Powell, who said it's illegal for him to replace me. I mean, where do you expect any friction between Trump 2.0 and the institutions that stand?
Well, the first one is going to happen over the question not of the appointment of any particular nominee, not of the confirmation process for any particular nominee, but whether there will be a confirmation process for nominees, right? The first point of confrontation is going to be between Trump and the Republican-controlled Senate, and it's going to be over the basic question of whether or not the Senate has any role in confirming any of these nominees, right? Trump will have to go to very arcane, very, very unusual and untested corners of the Constitution and precedent to find any way that he can shut down the House and the Senate himself. He's going to tell Republicans in Congress to shut themselves down, thus marginalizing themselves as one of the three supposedly co-equal branches of government, so that he can set up the executive branch himself without anybody having a say about it. Now, why would you want to do that rather than just have all of your nominees confirmed by the Senate, which I'm sure the Republicans in the Senate would be happy to do? You want them not to have a role in the confirmation process because you want the legislative branch to shrivel. You want the legislative branch to go away, because what authoritarians do is they consolidate power both within the executive and then in the person of the authoritarian leader. And so that's why it's an advantage to get a recess appointment rather than a Senate confirmed appointment, even if he's guaranteed Senate confirmation for even the craziest of these folks.
Your New Yorker piece is also about a defining feature of all autocrats. They fleece you. They rob you blind. Talk about how that might be a rub.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, just something for us in the media to keep in mind, but also something for us to be aware of in terms of what we can learn from other countries, what we can learn of American experiments with this kind of governance in the past. Autocrats, would-be authoritarians, are always crooks. They always steal. I mean, why bother getting rid of the rule of law if you can't then steal from the country blindly? I mean, it just always happens every time. And it's happened with all of our American demagogues throughout history. They've all been incredibly corrupt and have stolen from the people who they've, in some cases, persuaded to vote for them. So there's no reason to expect that this will be any different, particularly the way the run-up to this next term for Trump has gone. And it just, it's worth being aware of that, both in terms of self-protection, you know, watch your wallet. But I think it's also worth us being focused on, as the Fourth Estate, in terms of looking out for kleptocratic stuff, looking out for the establishment of an American oligarchy that isn't just sort of scary because it's unaccountable power, but it's scary because it's stealing the country out from under us. They do it in every country. They do it everywhere. And I don't think the American people are going to like it if it's well documented. It's our job to document it.
Rachel, our North Star on and off the air, and also someone who says every time we talk on and off TV that these jobs are such a tremendous privilege. I've thought about that. I've repeated that to my team and my staff and myself more than a few times over the last 10 days. Thank you very much for the privilege of getting to talk to you. A two-term governor from a state Donald Trump won by 30 points lays out what could be the winning formula for his party going forward. He'll also join us.
For the veterans out there that suffer from PTSD, for the single moms working 2 jobs and raising their 3 kids, for the dads who have to miss bedtime because they want to work that extra shift, and for the kids sleeping on the floor dreaming about a better America and a better future. This victory is for you. Thank you, Arizona.
That's what winning looked like Tuesday night. Democrats looking for under the couch Under the couch cushions reasons to be optimistic this week and hopeful don't have to look farther than that. That was in the battleground state of Arizona. Gallego's victory is especially impressive when you consider that Trump won Arizona. Same story in Michigan, Nevada, and Wisconsin, states that sent Trump to the White House, but a Democrat to the United States Senate. North Carolina went red in the presidential contest, but again chose a Democrat to be that state's governor. And reproductive rights, of the 7 states that approved abortion protections on ballot initiatives, 3 ultimately went for Trump for president. It's just something to keep in mind for those starting to peek ahead at the road forward for Democrats. Appropriately, one of those Democrats road mapping the party's future right now is Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear. In a New York Times essay, he writes this, quote, "While others are talking about political strategy and messaging, the way forward is really about focus and action. The next several years are the Democratic Party's chance to show the American people that we will not just run on, but also govern by addressing those core issues that can and will improve the lives of our people. And perhaps the best part, these core issues and concerns are not partisan, and addressing them helps Democrats and Republicans alike. That's a path forward for both the Democratic Party and for the country that we love." Joining our conversation is Democratic Governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to see you, too.
Tell me more about the piece that you wrote. I think people saw it as sort of chicken soup for the soul after Tuesday night, if folks were hoping that the results would be different.
Well, I was certainly disappointed by those results. I supported the vice president, and I think she ran a really hard race and tried her very best. My piece is not about looking back on the election, but forward. It's that idea that when people wake up in the morning, they're not thinking about politics. They're thinking about their job and whether they make enough to support their family. They're thinking about the next doctor's appointment for themselves or their parents or their kids. They're thinking about the roads and the bridges they drive each day, what traffic's going to be like. They're thinking about the public school they drop their kids off at, and they're thinking about public safety in their communities. And see, if you don't feel secure about those things, you don't get to anything else. You don't get to whatever the issue of the day is in Washington, D.C., and you don't get to any crazy thing that a politician said today or yesterday. And so my piece is about recommitting to waking up every single day and showing the American people that this is what we're focused on. That, yes, we'll stand up for important values. We'll push back against discrimination. We'll try to expand opportunity all over the United States. But people should know that every day we're working on creating better paying jobs, reducing the cost of health care, making sure our roads and bridges are safer, creating a world-class education for our kids, and making everybody not just safer, but feel safer. Those are just those core things that regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican or an independent, that you have to feel satisfied and secure before you can reach anything else.
You've mentioned safety and feeling safe and security. Just say a little bit more about where you think the Democratic deficiencies are on those gut issues.
Well, I think we have to recognize that you can't just give folks statistics about where violent crime is. You have to listen. You have to listen about whether people feel safe. Because at a time when we're talking not just about physical health, but mental health, if you don't feel safe in your community, it has a real impact on you. And then we've got to make sure that we take steps to address those concerns. So when we think about the different path forward, I hope we're always listening first, that we are talking to people and not at them, that we meet folks where they are, and we make sure that we don't summarily ever dismiss how somebody feels. Even if we disagree with it, we hear them out, and then we try to find that common ground, and we apply common sense. I wrote in my piece how Donald Trump just won Kentucky by 30 points just 1 year after I won it by 5 points. And if you look at it, inflation's actually gotten better over that period of time. But I think in Kentucky, when I ran, people saw that not only did I support policies that would create new jobs, but we were actually doing it. We opened the cleanest, greenest recycled paper mill in the country in Henderson, Kentucky. We're building the 2 largest battery plants on planet Earth
in Glendale. And while people might not believe what politicians say or what's in their platforms, my ads had me standing in front of those two massive facilities, and people certainly believe what they can see and feel and touch. But it's about priority, and it's about focus. If we're talking about what Donald Trump said today and the issue of the day in Washington and jobs, we're only talking a third of our time about jobs. And so when people see how we spend the time that we have to communicate with them, they just got to see that our major priorities are the things that they care about the most.
This has been Primetime Weekend. I'm Nicole Wallace. Please tune into Deadline White House and all of our primetime shows weekdays on MSNBC.